Right, morning. So for this session, try natin tong ganitong scheme na naka-record. So if it works then maybe we'll do this again in the future. So for this module, first session, let's talk about sequences in series. Ngayong session, ang goal natin, number one, ma-define ang sequence function, kung ano ang sequence at kung ano ang series. Makikita rin natin later on, nakita sa ilalim, no? Rewriting a series using sigma notation. It's also very important to find a formula for a given sequence and evaluate sigma notation. Okay? Teka, nalimutan kong pula pang aking pen. There we go. Okay. So, pag sinabi natin sequence function, tapos naman na natin yung idea ng functions in the previous term, towards the end of the term, But it's very particular for sequence functions. When we talk about sequence functions, we mean functions na ang domain ay natural numbers lang. Remember your natural numbers, they go from 1, 2, 3, etc. No? And instead of f of x, ang notation natin ay a sub n. Now, again, this is what a sequence function is. Remember, ang domain natin for sequence function ay natural numbers lamang. So, technically speaking, hindi ito katulad ng ating mga ibang graphs na smooth flowing curves, no? Since our domain is just natural numbers, generally speaking, makikita natin ang graph nito ay parang dots lang, along the on the coordinate plane. But we don't usually concern ourselves with the graph of sequence functions anyway. So, ang importante lang maintindihan natin ay ang domain ay natural numbers. Next. Oops, sorry. Pag sinabi naman natin mathematical sequence, remember that a sequence function, ang domain niya ay natural numbers. Now, ano yung range? Yung range natin is, remember when you plug in elements of the domain, now what turns out as the set of the outputs, if you will, in the function. Remember how a function can be described as some sort of a machine. You plug in something, then something comes out. Now, what we plug in sa sequence function ay puro natural numbers lang. Now, kung ano yung output, kung ano yung lalabas, and you arrange them in a sequence, then what you come up with is what we call a mathematical sequence. That is the range of the sequence function, and each element in that particular range is called a term of the sequence itself. Now, we'll understand this in a bit better. Now, again, this is not so important, but there are some sequences that are finite, meaning you only have a limited number of terms. On the other hand, of course, you have infinite sequences where you have an infinite rather, number of terms. Again, that's not super important. Mas importante naman sa lesson ng sequences ang pagtingin sa bawat term na nasa isang sequence, particularly determining what is the nth term of a certain sequence given something, given a formula, given certain conditions. Okay? Now, also, on a side note, good thing about this setup na may recording, you can pause and go back to perhaps a definition that you missed to hear. So, pause anytime, go back anytime if there's something that you did not get clearly. Now, halimbawa tayo, agad para mas kagat-kagad yung pag-intindi natin. Let's consider the following sequence function with the following rule, written as a rule, Again, sabi natin kanina, if it's a sequence function, in lieu of f of x, ang notation natin ay a sub n, katulad nito, a sub n, like that. Let's use a pink ink here, and a sub n. And of course, because it's a sub n, you can also imagine that our independent variable as opposed to x is now n. So in this case, a sub n is equal to 2 raised to n. Remember, ang domain natin ng sequence function ay natural numbers lang. So if I have this sequence function written as a formula, then I can determine several terms of the sequence. Now remember, again, ang ating domain ay natural numbers lang. So what if A were equal to sorry, not A. What if N were equal to 1? Kapag ang N mo equal to 1, etong buong formula mo na to, papalitan mo ng 1 yung mga makikita mo na N. So that will be A sub, instead of N, A sub 1 equals 2 raised to, instead of N, that's 1. So 2 raised to 1, of course, is 2. No? Now, what if N were 2? So the entire formula becomes A sub 2 equals 2 squared, or 4. Tama? Then if you have N to be 3, again, remember, itong N column natin, you expect puro ano lang talaga yan, puro natural numbers lang. So that will be A sub 3 equals 2 cubed, which is 8. Isa pa siguro, and 4, that's gonna be A sub 4 equals 2 to the 4th power, which is 16. And so on. Ano? Now, again, remember, itong label na to na A sub N ay basically yan yung particular terms ng isang sequence. Which is why if you plug in these elements of the domain, what you get are elements of the range. Di ba? Kaya itong si A sub 1, that's an output. No? And that output is equivalent to 2. When you plug in 2 in your formula, no, or in your rule, your output is A sub 2, which has an equivalent value of 4, and so on and so forth. So in other words, we can say na itong notations na to, A sub 1, A sub 2, those are basically term numbers. No? Where A sub 1, obviously, is the first term, A sub 2, the second term, A sub 4, the fourth term, at pag hinanap ko halimbawa ang A sub 10, basically what I'm looking for is the 10th term in the sequence. And if I do that, and if I look for it, no, A sub 10, again, papalitan ko lang ng 10 etong exponent ng 2. So, that's 2 raised to 10. Okay? So, ganun lang, simple lang, ano? Ngayon yung sequence function, an example of a sequence function. However, there are variations to writing the formula of a sequence function. Ano? Ito yung ginawa rin natin first 5 terms. Now, in roster form, again, sabi natin, ano, you can write the elements in the range, meaning the terms of the sequence. You can also write that in roster method. If you might remember your lesson on sets, roster method means you list the elements of that particular set. So you have something like this, no, 2 to the 4, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on, where each term is determined by the formula 2 raised to n, where n is the term number. Okay, so the 15th term is equivalent to 2 raised to 15. The 100th term is 2 raised to 100. Pretty simple. Alright. Now again, tulad ng sabi ko kanina, no, may variations sa pagsulat ng formula ng isang mathematical sequence. No? One of them is the explicit formula. I'll reveal the text already. And the other is recursive formula. Now, what is the difference, sir, between an explicit formula and a recursive formula? Now, besides these that you see on screen, you can pause your screen and digest what you see here. Pero to explain in plain language, in layman's terms, ang explicit formula ay isang paraan ng pagsulat, no, ng formula ng isang sequence wherein you should be able to determine a certain term, no, given the term number. Again, malalaman mo ang value ng isang particular term in the sequence if you know its term number. Katulad halimbawa nito na sa example natin, look at this. A sub n is equal to 2 raised to n. Now, if I wish to determine what the fifth term of this sequence is, I simply plug in 5 in lieu of n. Kasi nga, alam ko yung term number. So instead of n, I plug in 5, that's a to the fifth, not a to the fifth, a sub 5 rather, equals 2 to the fifth, which gives me 32. So again, I am able to determine a certain term given the term number, no? Sa ganung conditions, si explicit formula ang napapakinabangan ko, no? Si explicit formula, again, you should be able to determine a certain term given its term number. On the other hand, si recursive formula kasi, iba ang paraan niya ng pag-determine ng particular term, no? Ang paraan niya kasi, you're able to determine a certain term if you know, number one, first term or the first few terms of the sequence, and number two, the rule that you do given the previous terms to obtain succeeding terms. Now again, paano gamitin ang recursive formula? Kailangan alam mo ang first term or first few terms. That's condition 1. And condition 2, you should be able to know what to do with those terms and how they are related to the succeeding terms. No? Now, look at this example right here. This is a recursive formula. Generally, they are given in lines of equations. And recursive formulas will always have at least 2 lines. Wherein the first line is generally the first term of the sequence. Katulad nito, a sub 1 equals 2. That tells you that the the first term of the sequence, kasi a sub 1, that's the first term, is 2. Now, sir, what about the other terms? How would I know? Generally, it's the other lines in the recursive formula that tell you what the other terms are. No? Or how to determine, rather, the other terms. And in this particular case, notice, a sub n, meaning that's the nth term. Pinaliliwanag niya kung paano makukuha yung mga succeeding terms. Ang sabi niya dito, 2 times a sub n minus 1 plus 1. Now, what does that mean? 2 times a sub n minus 1 plus 1. Ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng a sub n minus 1 in relation to a sub n? No? Now, the answer is, in relation to a sub n minus 1 is the term immediately appearing before that. In other words, it's the previous term immediately, no? The term that immediately precedes a certain term. So, ang sinasabi ng recursive formula natin, to get a certain term, you have to determine daw the term that comes before it, which is a sub n minus 1. Ito. Then, what else does the formula say? I multiply that term by 2, kasi 2 times a sub n minus 1. And then finally, add 1 at the end. Ganun daw makuha yung succeeding terms. No? So, for example, itong ating same formula na to, how do we determine the terms in the sequence? No? Let's look for a sub 2. No? A sub 2. What is a sub 2 then? Paano kukunin yung a sub 2? Sabi niya, ang a sub 2 makukuha natin by looking at the previous term. What is the previous term to a sub 2? Ano mauuna kay a sub 2? Si a sub 1 syempre. Which in this case, we know to be 2. So si 2 daw, sabi ng formula, I will multiply that by 2. Sabi ng formula, ayan o, times 2. And then you add 1 at the end, plus 1. That should give you a 4 plus 1, which is 5. No? Ibig sabihin, pinaliliwanag ng recursive formula that to get each succeeding term, kukunin mo yung previous term. Sabi dito ha, sa second line dito, kukunin mo yung previous term, you double that, and then you add 1 at the end. No, ganun nagbe-behave etong particular formula na ito. No, that's what a recursive formula is. No, hindi siya masyadong straightforward katulad nitong explicit formula. So again, na recap. Sa explicit formula, you're able to determine a certain term if you know its term number. On the other hand, sa recursive formula, you often are able to determine a certain term given the terms before it, no, and knowing what to do with that term to get succeeding terms. Right? Now again, pause if you want, digest, go back, but I'll proceed with the next slide here. It's for some examples. Now, let's look for the 23rd term. 23rd term of the sequence whose general term is given by a sub n equals negative 1 raised to n times n squared. Now, this obviously is an explicit formula. No, kasi ang recursive formula, again, they typically appear with multiple lines of equations. And here, we're looking for the 23rd term. So, that's immediately what an explicit formula can help us out with. No, mahanap ang particular term given the term number. The term number is 23, no? And since I have my general form here of my explicit formula, a sub n equals negative 1 raised to the nth power times n squared. So pag hinahanap mo si 23rd term, simple lang, plug in mo lang si 23 instead of n. So that's gonna be negative 1 raised to the 23rd power, then 23 instead of n, and then squared. Okay, then simplify. Simplify mo lang naman. 23 squared is what? 23, that's 9, 9, 6, 23, that's 46 right there. 9, 2, 1, 529. So 529 there, and a multiplier of, that's a negative 1. No? So finally, a sub 23, in other words, the 23rd term, is negative 529. Diba? Simple lang. Just plug in the term number in the formula. You're able to determine immediately what that term is. Now, sir, what about a recursive formula? Ito, sample natin. Find the first 4 terms of the following although hindi sinabing recursive formula, it looks like one. No? You have multiple lines of it. Given ka ng first term at given ka ng rule kung paano malaman yung succeeding terms. So, what are the first 4 terms now of the sequence? It's very obvious. We can already begin with a sub 1. No? The first term, a sub 1, is 1. Sabi dito. But what about a sub 2? The second term. Anong sabi sa rule? Ito yung sabi sa rule. Look at this. Paano daw nakukuha yung succeeding terms? Ang sabi, you take the previous term, a sub n minus 1. Okay, nakuha ko na siya. Then multiply that by negative 2, no problem, and then finally add 1 to that. Diba? Simple lang. So again, if I follow that rule, I'm looking at a sub 2 here, the second term. So I take a look at the previous term, 1. Ito, si 1. I multiply that by negative 2. There you go. And then add 1 at the end. No? So that should give me 1 minus 2. That's negative 1. Paano pag 3? A sub 3, the third term. Again, I take the previous term, ito. Previous term, multiply that by negative 2, then add 1 at the end. That's gonna be a 1 plus 2, that's a 3. Tama? And then finally, a sub 4. I take the previous term, again, previous term right here, 3. I multiply that by negative 2, then I add 1 at the end. That's a 1 minus 6, that gives me a negative 5. Diba? Simple lang. Gagawin natin sa ating recursive formula. No? Simple lang. You just pick the previous term and then apply the rule in terms of obtaining the succeeding terms. Ano? It's very, very simple. Right? So that's 1. Negative 1, 3, negative 5. Again, you can pause and go back if you need to. Recursive formula, there you go. Now, a couple of practice items here. Find the general term for each of the items below. In other words, let's look for a rule that governs the terms of the following sequences. Look at the first one. Wala bang mapansin dyan? Pause konti. 1, 3, 9, 27, 81. Don't they look like powers of 3? Mukhang powers of 3, ano? So in that particular case, if these were powers of 3, this is actually 3 sub 0, 3 sub 1, 3 sub 2, 3 sub 3, 3 sub 4, and so on. Diba? So if we will write a general rule for that, wherein, still remember, this is a sequence formula, so your domain should still be natural numbers. But our first, but the exponents don't seem to be natural numbers. They seem to be whole numbers. But we can do something with that very easily. The base will always be 3, we know that. And the domain of the sequence is the natural numbers, we know that too. But since the exponents appear to be the whole numbers, they go from 0 to whatever. I would instead use my exponent as n minus 1. Tama? Yan yung general form ko na kagad. 3 raised to the power of n minus 1. Kasi, tingnan nyo mabuti ha, what if the first, what is the first term of the sequence? First term, so n is equal to 1. I will simply plug in 1 there. That's 1 minus 1. That's 3 raised to 0, which is 1 right here. The second term, 3 raised to 2 minus 1. That's 3 to the first power, and so on. So, ang final answer ko rito ay 3 raised to n minus 1 for the first one. Okay? Now, what about the second one right here? For the second one, I seem to observe 7, 12. Parang nagpa-plus 5 na nagpa-plus 5, ano? Plus 5, plus 5. There you go. So, mukhang yun yung ating constant addend to each term. And if you remember your lesson from Mrs. Eugenio from last year, that constant number that you keep on adding to a certain to produce a certain sequence, that behaves as your slope basically, no? Yan yung slope mo, that constant change right there, that's your slope. So we are looking at something linear, no, na ang slope mo ay 5, no? So that's something like 5x plus whatever, no, kung meron man. But in this case, if our domain is the set of the naturals, I know for now that I need to use 5 as a slope. But if you will be using your domain, your natural numbers as your domain, and 5 being the slope, and remember your domain now acts as your your independent variable. So instead of 5x, I go 5n, where n will still be the natural numbers. But it's not enough that it's just 5n. Kasi kung ang first term mo ay 7 at ang n mo for the first term is 1, hindi nagmamatch. So may kulang dito sa ating formula. 5n nga lang ba itong 7? But how does it become 7? Parang may kulang. What if we add the 2? Tignan mabuti ha. 5n plus 2 is in fact gives me 7 if n were equal to 1. The first term, no? Pwede natin sabihin term number, no? Kapag ang term number mo ay 1, first term, so that's a sub 1, I will replace n by 1, that's 5 times 1 plus 2. In fact, gives me 7. Tama. What if the term number is 2? Term number is 2, it's going to be 5 times 2 plus 2. 5 times 2, 10 plus 2 is in fact 12. Tama pa rin naman, ano? 12 and so on, and you'll see that this in fact is correct. Our general formula for the nth term in this sequence is 5n plus 2. Diba? Pretty simple. In fact, pwede mo rin gamitin ito na yung letter B. Pwede kang mag-recursive formula dito where the first term is 7, diba? First term 7 and a sub n. Anong ginagawa natin to obtain the nth term? Ba ginagawa natin? Kasi ang pattern natin dito nag-add ng 5 eh. So what we do is we take the previous term, a sub n minus 1, and add 5. Diba? So this is, lagyan natin ng brace to. Yan yung recursive formula nitong letter B. This is its explicit formula, EF, and this is its recursive formula, second one. Yeah, pretty simple. Okay, again, you can pause. It's the beauty of this. You can pause and go back to the example kung may hindi naintindihan. Ayun, lumabas na sila doon. Alright, good. Now, when we talk about a series, on the other hand, kanina pinag-usapan natin sequence. A sequence is just an array of numbers yan, you know? Basically, the sequence, a mathematical sequence, is the range of a sequence function. Now, what about a series? Pag sinabi natin series, which is typically denoted by S sub n, pag sinabi natin series, this is an indicated sum of a certain number of terms. For example, meron kang isang sequence. Tinanong sa'yo, ano ang sum ng first 10 terms? No? First 10 terms of that sequence. Now, that particular indicated sum of the first 10 terms is what we refer to as a series. No? Pretty simple. Special name lang yan. And as we move further into this particular module, makikita natin yung iba't ibang klase ng series. So, for example, if you have the sequence 3, 5, 7, 9, no? Where and I'm looking for instance, tawag dito, the series of this particular sequence. Halimbawa, meron ka S sub 1. Pag sinabing S sub 1, remember, ito yung ginagamit natin na notation for series. S sub n, S sub something. Where that something, that n, is the indication of how many, the first n terms, bale. No? So, what does S sub 1 mean? S sub 1 means the sum of the first one term. Basically, it sounds ridiculous, pero that's what it means. The sum of the first one term, which in this case is just 3. Kaya S sub 1 is 3. But what about S sub 2? Ang S sub 2, ano ibig sabihin ng S sub 2? Ang ibig sabihin niyan, the sum of the first two terms. So now you have 3 plus 5. So that should be an 8. No? S sub 3, consequently, is the sum of the first 3 terms. So 3 plus 5 is 8 plus 7, that's 15, and so on. No? Yan yung ibig sabihin ng series. That's the indicated sum of the first n terms to be added. Yan, 15. There you go. S sub 4, of course, you add 9 to that. It's gonna give you 24. Diba? Again, pretty simple. You can pause and go back if there's something you did not understand. But generally, that's the notation for series. S sub a certain number. That certain number is the number of first however many terms that you need to add in that particular sequence. Now, eto yung isang importanteng notation pagdating sa series, no, yung sigma notation. I thought this was already your lesson in grade 9, di pala, no? So yung Greek letter na sigma, uppercase sigma, ito yung mukhang letter E right here, no? This is indicative in mathematics of a summation, no, that is used to denote the sum of a certain number of terms in a certain sequence. Now, let's go right to an example. Katulad nito, 3, 5, 7, 9. No? Now, notice how si 3, 5, 7, 9 has a general formula, if you will, of 2n plus 1. So, saan mo nakuha yung 2n plus 1 na yan? Again, if you examine these, the way you get the succeeding terms is by adding the constant 2, which again, by grade 9 lessons, will seem to be your slope. So n will still be my independent variable. But to obtain the actual values here, kailangan mo pa nung nung b value, di ba? Yung y-intercept, which in this case is plus 1. No? So pa plus 1 ka. Yan. Right? So it's a 2n plus 1, your general formula for that particular sequence. Now, it can be written instead, no, as this. Look at this notation right here. And let me tell you outright that this is the same as saying S sub 4. No, S sub 4, the sum of the first 4 terms. Because if you notice, instead of the S sub 4 here, what we see in sigma notation is using a certain formula, 2n plus 1, which is the general formula for this sequence. And it also tells me which terms I need to add together. Ang limitation kasi ni S notation, S sub 4, ang iniisip mo kagad dyan is adding the first n terms. So, starting with the first term down to the nth term, yung i-add mo. But the sigma notation is quite flexible. Pwede kang mag-start ng second term hanggang fourth term. Third term hanggang 11th term ang i-add mo, no? So, in those instances, mas magandang gamitin si sigma notation. And sir, how do we know saan tayo nagsisimula na term at saan nagtatapos? Eto, mga numbers na to, above and below the sigma, Greek letter sigma. No, those numbers will tell you where to begin and where to end. And in this particular example right here, it tells me to start with the first term, the number below, and end with the fourth term. Na yun yung mga i-add natin. First to the fourth term. So, you're looking for the sum of the first 4 terms din naman in this particular notation. Now, some other notes on that. Again, this is called the summation notation, no? Pag gumagamit ka ng Greek letter sigma. And we read this as the sum No? Dahil yung sigma letter natin, the sum or the summation as n right here, which is called the index of summation, si n. As n goes from 1 to 4 of the quantity 2n plus 1. Again, ang basa natin dyan, the sum or the summation as n goes from, tingin sa baba, 1, tingin sa taas, to 4 of the expression 2n plus 1. No, again, si n yung index of summation. Ibig sabihin, siya yung nagsasabi sa atin kung saan tayo magsisimula ng pagbilang. Pang ilang term ang ini-include natin. Again, ang domain pa rin naman talaga ng n ay natural numbers. So, in this particular case, therefore, look at this. If I were to simplify that expression, what would that look like? Simple lang. Basically, ang ginagawa natin dito, yung expression na ating kinukuha na ng summation, ipa-plug in mo lang repeatedly yung mga n values. Kasi n will go from 1 to 4. So, what does that mean? What if n were 1 muna? What would be this expression? This expression, if n were 1, would be 2 times 1 plus 1. That would be my first term, if n were 1. Ayan, n were 1. But remember, n goes from 1 to 4. So, what if n were 2? So, kapag 2 yan, ganun din, pa-plug mo lang 2 times, plug mo rito yung 2 plus 1. And remember, this is summation. So, each of these terms you have to add together. Plus, di pa tayo tapos kasi 1 to 4 yan Goes from 1 to 4. What if it's 3? That's gonna be 2 times 3 plus 1. Plus, finally, hanggang 4 daw 2 times 4 plus 1. And then we simplify. This is 2, 1, 1, 3 plus, kung makita nyo, ito rin naman talaga yung ating roster form dito. 3, 5, 7 plus 9. Diba? You simplify. This is 10 plus 14, that's 24. Correct? It's pretty simple. So this sigma notation is equal to 24. No? Pag sinimplify mo. Diba? Very simple. Oops. 24. There you go. Now, pause. Look at this blue text, the lower left corner. How does it differ from 2n plus 1? Sir, parang pareho naman. Pero merong isang key difference. Notice, yung parenthesis. And that makes all the difference. Itong ginawa natin dito sa itaas, yung yellow. As we were plugging in 1, our expression was always 2n plus 1 because it is enclosed in grouping symbol. I'm taking the summation of that particular whole binomial expression as n goes from 1 to 4. However, pag wala ka nung parenthesis na yon, ang kinukuha na mo lang ng summation ay yung 2n. Doon lang siya nakadugtong. Separate term itong plus 1 na to. Ibig sabihin, sir, paano yan? Pag ganyan, ito lang muna ang kukunan ko. Sa dulo ko magpa-plus 1. So, what will that look like? Remember, ang formula natin, 2n as n goes from 1 to 4. So, if n were 1, I will have 2 times 1. Plus, kagad yan, what if n were 2? It's gonna be a 2 times 2. If n were 3, 2 times 3. If n were 4, 2 times 4. And then, etong buong to, tapos na sir, nag 1 to 4 na ako. Correct. So, na-evaluate ko na etong part na to ng summation notation. Pero remember, wala sa parenthesis, hindi kasama sa quantity, yung plus 1. So, sa dulo pa ako magpa-plus 1 dito. Okay. So, that's gonna be 2 plus 4 plus 6 plus 8. And then your plus 1 at the end. Okay? So, that's a 10, 10, that's a 21. So, tingnan iba. Ito, ang sagot natin kanina, 24. Dito, ang sagot natin ngayon, 21. So, iba yun. It makes all the difference pag may grouping symbol or wala. Okay? So, be careful with the reading and writing of summation notation. So, practice. Reveal ko muna and then, oops, hindi pala pwede. O yan. Pause. Pause muna ngayon and then try to solve it yourself. Okay, kung na-solve nyo na, Yan, kinaganda nito. Pwede tayo mag-pause. Ano? This will be what? The summation of this expression as n goes from 1 to 3. This is equal to, let's plug in 1. It's going to be 4 minus 1 over 1. That's the first one. Plus 4 minus 2 over 2. The second one. Plus 4 minus 3 over 3. Oh, ba? Simple lang. Napakasimple. 4 minus 1, 3 over 1 is 3. Plus 4 minus 2, that's a 2. Over 2, that's 1. Plus 4 minus 3 is 1. Over 3, I 1 third. That gives me 4 and 1 third. Diba? Very simple. Very, very simple. Okay. Next. Pause ulit. Pause and then try to evaluate that summation notation. Okay, play ulit. Play. Again walang parenthesis. Tignan mabuti. Walang parenthesis. So, hindi iba yan kapag may ganito So, ang plus 1 natin, ibig sabihin sa dulo pa. So, first term, n squared lang bale ang paulit-ulit natin gagawin as n goes from 3 to 6. Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina. Ang index of summation mo sa ilalim, hindi yan necessarily 1. It tells you where to start. So, pwede yan maging 3, pwede yan maging 10, etc. etc. So, this is gonna be what? N squared as n goes from 3 to 6. The first one will be 3 squared. Yeah. Plus 4 squared. Plus 5 squared. Plus 6 squared. So, tapos na ako sa 3 to 6. And now, I add my 1 here at the end. Right? Plus 1 na ako dyan. So, simplify ka na lang. This is gonna be 9. It's gonna be 16. That's 25. That's 36 plus 1. Okay? Okay na bala mag-simplify niyan. Ayoko na i-simplify. Add lang naman. So, you should get what? 87 daw. Okay? 87. Pretty simple. Extra practice item. So, baliktad. Given kayo nung series, ibigay niyo yung summation notation. Okay? Again, pause the video muna and then try it yourself. Okay, dapat nag-play kayo, may sagot na kayo. 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, 6. Paano to, sir? Parang ang gulo ata. Pero may pattern naman 2 times 3 plus 3 times 4 plus 4 times 5. Pwede. So, kung isulat natin in sigma notation, ilatag ko na yung sigma ko dito. Sigma notation. Look at the first term right there. 2 times 3. Remember, ang n natin, generally speaking, ang domain lang naman natin talaga ay natural numbers So you can already assume that how can I use the first term, the natural number 1 to generate that first term? If n were 1, what expression represents 2 and 3? So if n were 1, well, obviously, 2 would be n plus 1. Tama? And 3 would be n plus 2. O, see? Meron ka na kagad. N plus 1 times n plus 2. In fact, yun na siya, Look, the first term. This is the first term. If n were 1, this would be 1 plus 1, 2. This would be 1 plus 2, 3. Tama. Ayan yung 2 times 3 mo. So first, what if n were 2? If n were 2, this would be 3, this would be 4. So swak, tumpak na. Nakuha na natin yung expression natin. So I'll erase this right here. Pero hindi pa tapos kasi kailangan may sulat yung index of summation. I need to go from 1, kasi ito yung form natin, 1, 2, hanggang ano? Look at this, 5. How do you get to 5? Isn't that 4 din? Diba? As n goes from 1 to 4. In fact, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms right there. So this is one way of doing it. Pero meron pang isa. May isa pa pang pwedeng gawin. Kasi nga sabi natin kanina, di ba? Si sigma notation, you do not always have to start with 1 at the bottom. Tingnan to. Ito naman yung lumalakad 2, 3, 4, 5. So why not instead start at 2? Pwede rin. N is equal to 2. Ayun, if n were equal to 2, then my first factor for every term is just n, not n plus 1 anymore. And then the second term would be your n plus 1. Diba? Kasi if n were 1, this would be, sorry, if n were 2 rather, if n were 2, this would be 2 times 3. Ito pa rin yung first term mo. What if n were 3? This would be 3 times 4. Ayun pa rin yung next term mo. So this is another option right here. Instead of starting with 1, I start with 2. But where do I end? I end with 5. Tama? So this is option A, sigma notation. Option B. No, either way, makukuha mo pa rin naman dyan yung tamang sagot. Yung. Yan sila mismo. Again, remember, the index of notation at the bottom doesn't necessarily have to be 1. Pwedeng hindi. Okay? Now, what about the second one? 1/5, 3/10, 1/3, 7/20th, 9/25. Well, ang medyo malinaw sa akin, uy sir, parang 5, 10, 15 dapat to, 20, 25. Ay sir, parang 1, 3, parang 5 yata dapat to, 7, 9. And in fact, you'd be correct. As if you follow the pattern here, 5, 10, imagine this to be a 15, 20, 25, tama? Skip counting ka by 5. This is 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 are odd numbers. Where in fact, look at this, 5/15 is in factor 1/3. So, simpler version lang siya. No? But, for your visualization, you can write 5 here instead. Yan. 5 yan. 15 yan. Para mas ma-visualize nyo yung nangyayari. Now, let's write that in summation notation. Now, look at this. Yan. Latag na natin yung ating sigma. Right there. The summation of. Now, at the bottom, feeling ko mas madali mag-start sa ilalim eh. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Para ka nag-skip counting ng 5. So, again, how do I factor in my domain na natural numbers? Isn't this like 5 times 1? 5 times 2? 5 times 3? And so on. So, ito na yung mga naturals mo. 1, 2, 3, and so on. So, that means, ang denominator ko ay 5n. O, diba? 5n. Now, what about my numerators? My numerators appear to be odd numbers. And odd numbers, I'm not sure if you covered this in grade 8. You should have. Ang general form natin ng odd numbers, diba? 2n minus 1. Yun na nga yun, actually. Kasi ang even numbers mo ay 2n. So, odd numbers mo generally, ang form yan 2n minus 1. At swak, in fact, look, if n were 1, 2 times 1 minus 1, ito, 1 right there. If n were 2, 2 times 2 minus 1, ayun yung 3 right there. No? So, odd numbers yung ibabaw mo, numerators. So, that means it's 2n minus 1 here on top. And now, finally, your index of notation. N goes from, simula naman ako sa 1 hanggang, it's not infinite, so 1 to 5. So, let me rewrite that here para mas malinis. The summation of the summation as n goes from 1 to 5 of the expression 2n minus 1 all over 5n. That is my sigma notation for letter B. Okay? Pause. Tama ba tayo? 2n minus 1 over 5n. Tama naman. Okay? It's pretty simple. Pretty simple. Dali pa. Now, again, you can pause and look at the other posts on your Google Classroom for your entry and exit tickets for next time. Again, nandun lang ako sa call. Dapat, you can ask your questions there and or email me your questions. Thank you.